The piercing wail cut through the rumble of the subway car like a knife through silence, each sob seeming to echo the helplessness that every parent knows but prays never to face in public. Margaret Chen clutched her 3-month-old daughter closer, her designer coat wrinkled from hours of failed attempts at comfort, her usually immaculate appearance now disheveled with exhaustion and desperation. Margaret wasn't supposed to be here. The CEO of a Fortune 500 tech company didn't ride the subway as she had drivers, private cars, helicopters when needed. But today, everything had gone wrong. Her nanny had called in sick, her husband was in Tokyo on business, and little Emma had been screaming for 6 straight hours. In a moment of pure maternal desperation, Margaret had grabbed her daughter and fled her Manhattan penthouse, thinking maybe the motion of the train might finally bring peace. It hadn't. The other passengers were beginning to stir with irritation. A businessman in a rumpled suit shot pointed glances over his newspaper. A teenager pulled her earbuds out with an exaggerated sigh. An elderly woman muttered something about spoiled rich kids under her breath, eyeing Margaret's clearly expensive handbag and shoes. Margaret felt their judgment like physical weight. She had conquered boardrooms, negotiated million-dollar deals, commanded respect from the most powerful people in the country. But here, holding her inconsolable daughter, she felt utterly powerless. Tears began to well in her eyes as Emma's cries intensified, tiny fists flailing in distress. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered to the car at large, her voice barely audible over her daughter's wails. "I'm so sorry." That's when she noticed him. 3 seats down sat a man who looked like life had tested him in every possible way. His jeans were clean but worn thin at the knees, his jacket patched in 2 places with careful stitches. His work boots were scuffed from honest labor, and his hands as strong, calloused hands held a small girl of about 4 who was fast asleep against his chest despite the chaos around them. What struck Margaret wasn't his appearance, but his expression. While everyone else looked annoyed or uncomfortable, his face showed only compassion. His dark eyes, tired but kind, met hers with understanding rather than judgment. The man, whose name was David Rodriguez, had been watching the scene unfold with growing empathy. He recognized desperation when he saw it. He'd been there himself plenty of times since his wife Sophia had passed away 2 years ago, leaving him to raise their daughter Lucia alone on a construction worker's salary. David had learned things about babies that most men never needed to know. He'd walked hospital corridors at 3 a.m. when Lucia had croup. He'd mastered the art of one-handed diaper changes while holding a phone to schedule work around daycare pickups. He'd become fluent in the language of infant distress, the subtle differences between hunger cries, tired cries, and the particular wail that meant something deeper was wrong. And right now, listening to Emma's cries, David's experienced ear detected something specific. This wasn't hunger or tiredness. This was overstimulation of the kind of sensory overload that happened when a baby had simply absorbed too much of the world and needed to reset. Without overthinking it, David gently shifted his sleeping daughter to free one arm and stood up. The subway car swayed, but he moved with the practiced balance of someone who'd spent years on construction sites. He approached Margaret slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of generations of family who'd worked hard for everything they had. "I don't mean to intrude, but may I try something?" Margaret looked up, startled. In her world, strangers didn't approach. They certainly didn't offer help. Her first instinct was to politely decline, to maintain the protective barriers that wealth and status had built around her. But something in David's eyes, a recognition of shared struggle, Perhaps a made her nod. She's overstimulated, David said gently, not reaching for the baby but instead beginning to hum. It was a low, rhythmic sound and not quite a lullaby, but something deeper. A working man's song that seemed to vibrate from his chest rather than his throat. The effect was immediate. Emma's cries began to soften, her rigid little body relaxing incrementally. David continued humming, adding a gentle swaying motion that seemed to match the natural rhythm of the train. Within 30 seconds, Emma's wails had reduced to hiccups. Within a minute, she was quiet. Margaret stared in amazement. "How did you?" "My daughter used to do the same thing," David said, glancing down at Lucia, who was still sleeping peacefully against his other arm. "When there's too much noise, too much light, too much everything, sometimes they just need someone to help them find quiet again." But David wasn't done. Recognizing that Emma was calm but not yet settled, he made a decision that would change everything. Very carefully, he began to remove his worn denim jacket. "What are you doing?" Margaret asked. "She needs to feel safe," David explained, gently draping his jacket over Emma like a blanket. The jacket smelled like honest worker sawdust and sunshine, with just a hint of the fabric softener he used because Lucia liked her clothes to smell fluffy. But more than that, it carried something intangibly: the warmth of a father's love, the security of someone who had learned to protect what mattered most. Emma settled completely, her tiny fingers grasping the soft denim. For the first time in hours, she was peaceful. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but they were different. Tears now, not frustration or embarrassment, but overwhelming gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. David was already stepping back, giving her space. "No need," he said simply. "We've all been there." But Margaret couldn't let it end there. As the train pulled into the next station, she stood up, still holding Emma carefully. "Please," she said, reaching into her purse. "Let me give you something." David shook his head before she could finish the sentence. "I didn't help expecting anything back," he said. "That's not how it works." The train doors opened, and Margaret knew she had seconds to decide. She could walk away, return to her world, and this would become just another story, or she could do something different. "What's your name?" she asked quickly. "David Rodriguez. And this is Lucia." He smiled down at his daughter, who was just beginning to wake up. Margaret made her choice. She reached into her wallet and pulled out her business card, but then stopped. Instead, she grabbed a pen and wrote something on the back. "My personal number," she said, handing it to him. "Not because you asked for anything, but because good people shouldn't have to struggle alone." As the train doors began to close, Margaret called out one more thing: "Keep the jacket for now. Emma seems to like it." David looked down at the business card as the train pulled away. Margaret Chen, CEO, Chen Technologies. But what caught his attention was what she'd written on the back: "Thank you for reminding me what really matters. A grateful mother." 3 days later, David's phone rang. It was Margaret, but she wasn't calling to get her jacket back. She was calling because she'd spent 3 days thinking about their encounter, about the kindness he'd shown without expectation of reward, about the way he'd treated her not as a CEO or a wealthy woman, but simply as a mother in need. "I have a proposition," she said. "Chen Technologies is building a new community center in Queens. We need a construction supervisor or someone who understands that building isn't just about structures, it's about creating places where families can thrive." David was quiet for a long moment. "I don't have a college degree," he finally said. "But you have something better," Margaret replied. "You have wisdom, and kindness, and the kind of leadership that shows up when someone needs help." not when someone's watching. 6 months later, David stood in the completed community center, watching Lucia play in the children's area alongside Emma, who had become her unlikely best friend. The facility included a daycare center, after-school programs, job training workshops, and a dozen other services designed to support working families. Margaret approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the center's cafe. Copyright. Any regrets about taking the job? She asked. David smiled, watching their daughters giggle together over a picture book. Just one, he said. I wish I could have met you sooner. The subway jacket to Emma's security blanket for months now hung framed in David's office, with a small plaque beneath it. Sometimes the most unthinkable thing you can do is simply choose kindness. Because sometimes, in a world that often feels divided by wealth and status, education and opportunity, the most radical act isn't grand gesture or charitable donation. Sometimes the most unthinkable thing you can do is see another person's struggle and respond with simple, human compassion of the kind that builds bridges across any divide, and reminds us all that at our core, we're just people trying to take care of the ones we love.